Throughout the United States, prejudice towards Black Americans was widespread during this period, whether it was openly racist hostility or silent complicity. By the 1950s, racial discrimination and segregation had become enshrined in law and an accepted part of daily life. However, the reasons behind this racial inequality differed in the North and South of the country. For example, in the northern states, segregation was actually the result of racial discrimination. With incredibly low pay and limited employment opportunities for Black Americans, the majority were forced to live in the poorest urban districts, known as ghettos. These dilapidated areas faced overcrowding, high crime rates, and limited access to basic public services. Education and medical facilities for those living in the ghettos was significantly underfunded compared to what was available to the white population, as buildings were not well maintained and the basic needs of schools and hospitals were always in short supply. In the southern states, openly racist legislation, known as the Jim Crow laws, legally enforced segregation. Black Americans were banned from certain cinemas, restaurants, and even churches that were signposted for whites only. Furthermore, so-called black areas were created on public transport in order to ensure racially segregated seating. The name Jim Crow came from a 19th century play called The Kentucky Rifle. White actor Thomas Rice used blackface makeup and disheveled clothing to portray Black Americans as lazy and unintelligent, while performing a song and dance called Jump Jim Crow. Schools in the southern states were segregated to such an extent that black children were not permitted to attend their local school if it had been classified for white children only. Instead, they were forced to travel to the nearest black school, either by bus or more commonly on foot. Black schools were severely underfunded, were poorly maintained, and had access to far fewer educational resources, such as textbooks and stationery. This was due to the significantly lower allocation of state budgets for the education of black children. In the United States, there are two levels of policymakers. Federal laws are implemented across the entire country, while state laws are only for the population of that state. Therefore, segregation could be legally enforced at state level without federal interference. During the 1950s, white attitudes towards Black Americans in the southern states were appalling. Many white Americans were raised to believe themselves to be racially superior, and beliefs that black people were lazy, unintelligent, and potentially criminal permeated society. Similarly to the North, employment opportunities were limited, with low-paid and unskilled farm labor or domestic service on wealthy white plantations among the most common employers. As post-war industry soared in the United States, factory work became one of the most common forms of employment. However, due to white attitudes at the time, even low-paid positions for large employers such as car manufacturers were withheld from Black Americans. With such overt racism in the South, it was common for white people to call black people by their first names, which was seen as impolite among society for the period. Black American adults were often referred to as boy or girl in order to highlight the contempt for their lower status. Shaking hands with black people was also avoided by white business owners, as it was seen as a sign of equality and respect. As a result, business deals between black and white-owned companies would often be conducted through a white intermediary. During this period, there were some white Southerners who acted against the widespread racial discrimination, but they were a small minority and faced the same violent treatment as Black Americans. Racism among the police and law courts in the southern states was endemic, as those who enforced the law and passed sentences often applied their interpretations of legal matters through the lens of their racial prejudice. In the Deep South, many judges and policemen were also members of the Ku Klux Klan and did not investigate complaints from Black victims of crime. In some cases, racial attacks could even be carried out by off-duty officers wearing white hoods, who would then shut down investigations. The brutality of racial injustice in the southern states was commonplace, as Black Americans could be beaten to secure confessions for crimes they could not have committed. Furthermore, many Black Americans were imprisoned without legal charges. During court hearings, Black people were not permitted to be on the jury, and defendants were often represented by white lawyers, who sometimes made little effort to hide their prejudice against their own clients. In murder cases where one Black person murdered another, police investigations were carried out less thoroughly and could even be dismissed as simply a Negro crime with no official charges or justice for the family of the victim. One of the most terrifying aspects of legal matters in the southern states was that Black Americans were often well aware that the government officials who were supposed to protect them may also be a part of the racist groups that could attack them. Therefore, legal justice was never assured. The Second World War marked an important turning point for progress in the fight for civil rights. Over 1 million Black Americans served in segregated military units, with millions more in support roles and important positions in arms production facilities. The role of Black servicemen and women during the war, coupled with America's wartime rhetoric about democracy and freedom over tyranny, created new hopes and expectations for equality after the war, in recognition of their service to the United States. The emerging Cold War further highlighted the racial contradictions in America. As the United States positioned itself as leader of the free world, the Soviet Union highlighted the treatment of its Black citizens as direct evidence of American hypocrisy. This international scrutiny placed a great deal of pressure on the federal government to address racial inequality, particularly in the South, in order to maintain the democratic image of the United States against their communist enemies. By 1956, approximately 20% of Southern Black Americans were registered voters. This represented a significant increase from the pre-war figure of just 3%, although this was still disproportionately low. Voting rights represented a crucial area for reform in the fight for racial equality. In order to prevent Black Americans from voting, various tactics were used to suppress Black voters in the southern states and avoid the election of Black political leaders. White employers would threaten to terminate Black employee contracts if they registered to vote or actually voted in elections. Furious white mobs blocked access to registration and polling locations, and Black citizens pursuing legal voting rights faced violent persecution. Furthermore, state governments implemented discriminatory registration requirements, particularly literacy tests. It was known that levels of education among Black citizens were lower due to the inequality in schooling, whereas few white voters were made to take the test in order to complete their registration.